Welcome to episode 57 of the Empowering Ability Podcast.
You are listening to the Implying Ability Podcast and raising expectations for what is possible for people with developmental disabilities. And here's your host, my brother Elda.
Hey folks, welcome to the podcast. I hope you enjoyed that new introduction and the new music with my sister, Sarah, and I just love it. So I hope you do as well. Now, I also love this conversation that I'm bringing you today with Michael Kendrick on imagining better. And in reflection of this conversation with Michael, the question popped into my mind of how to create a life worth living. And a life worth living, you might be thinking, Eric, are you implying that there are lives that aren't worth living? And it's really a big question. And I want you to consider that question for yourself. What I do know is that people with developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities are devalued and suppressed, largely unconsciously, by society, by our families, and even by ourselves. And I'm guilty of this too. When a person's devalued, it's very difficult to access the opportunities that everyone else can access. And this often results in isolation, loneliness, and suffering. And again, I ask, a life worth living. I ask you to consider that for yourself. And what I also know is that I can do better. I know that we can do better. And I know our society can do better. And it really all starts with vision. So why do we need a vision? Well, as human beings, vision is the sense that we trust the most. We trust our eyes. And from an evolutionary perspective, we're always looking out for dangers and looking for rewards. And this was really key to our survival. And also, where we look is where we go. So I want to give you an example of surfing. So if you're surfing and you're looking at the rocks, you're going to end up on the rocks. If you're surfing and you're looking at the beach, then you'll end up at the beach. And here I'm talking about vision as one of our 5 human senses. However, these truths about our senses apply to our vision of the future. And if we can imagine, or if we can see in our minds where we want to be in the future, where we want to be 5 years from now, or however far out you want to look, 2 years from now, 10 years from now, we can trust, we can see that we can get there, and we start to move in that direction. So when we're looking at the destination we want to get to in the future, 5 years from now, we move in that direction. Just like the surfer that looks at the beach and steps off their board into the soft sand, instead of crying out for help to be saved while being pushed up on the jagged rocks because they were looking at the rocks. So I'm really excited to bring you this conversation with Michael Kendrick on vision. And Michael Kendrick, this is the second time around on the podcast with Michael. And Michael Kendrick is a PhD. He's an international consultant in human services. He's involved in consulting, education, and evaluative work with a wide variety of groups, so governments, private agencies, advocacy groups, community groups, university and colleges, and he does his work across the world. And he really brings some great perspectives. He's a deep thinker, and I'm excited to bring you this conversation. We cover the topics of what is vision, why is it so important? Why is vision so important for people with intellectual or developmental disabilities? And how do you go about creating a vision? So without any further ado, here's my conversation with Michael Kendrick. Hi, Michael. Thanks for joining me today on the podcast.
Great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you back on for round 2. Excited to have or continue our conversation. And today I'm excited to have our conversation around vision and cover some different aspects of vision. So I guess maybe Michael, to start, it might be helpful if you could briefly explain to our listeners what vision is.
Well, it's typically the way we see the world. So in that sense, vision differs from one person to another as to how they see and understand the world that they're in. And it's quite possible for people to have different content in their vision. In other words, the substance of their vision may be quite different. For instance, a good example of this is that there may be subject matter that we have no vision on because we've never thought about it before, whereas other people might have a very developed understanding of particular subjects or aspects of the world. So in that sense, vision is created by people about the world that they're interested in or committed to. And that vision, of course, can shift over time. But nonetheless, we operate with almost like looking out into the world from some kind of understanding of that world.
Okay, so it's this, it's something that we create in our mind. It can help us think about what we want the world or our world to look like in the future. And I think there's maybe some people out there that think, well, that sounds kind of fluffy. Like a vision, do I really need one? Like I just do what I do, and I kind of just live my life. What are your thoughts on that when you hear somebody say, well, a vision's fluffy?
Well, in some instances, it can be quite fluffy. So in that sense, vision can differ even within the same person over time. For instance, your understanding of tragedy may change dramatically when you've been through a tragedy. But up until that point, you hadn't had a real taste of tragedy, so your vision for it might be quite limited. So in that sense, our life experiences shift our vision, and we can be self-conscious about vision and shift it without a catalyst, almost just through our own initiative. We can decide to look at the world in a quite different way. A good example of this would be the decision to see the good in people. Would be a way to approach people as if there is good in people. But if your vision is that most people are nasty or unpleasant or whatever, then what you're going to encounter is nasty, unpleasant people, because that's sort of what you're looking for.
Right. And that translates into how you live your life and how you show up. And to me, the way you've described that, like when you talk about how somebody, might view another person, whether, everybody's good or everybody's bad, to me, that sounds very close to a belief. Is there a difference between what you're describing as a vision and a belief, or are those the same things?
No, the belief would be the conviction at the time about the vision. So our beliefs alter our vision. And you mentioned a very good word, which is mind, because mind creates consciousness, and consciousness really illuminates the world for us. And depending on the nature of the consciousness. So we're constantly creating new reality and creating new beliefs as we go.
That helps to differentiate the two between vision and beliefs. And so why is it so that you've talked about what a vision is? Why is it important for, maybe we can start at the individual level, like why is it important for an individual to have a vision for their life? And maybe we can go maybe even more specific here. Why is it important for an individual with a disability or a developmental disability, intellectual disability, to have a vision for their life?
Well, because if it's a vision that creates opportunities for them, then it creates life-giving possibilities. And if there is no vision for those possibilities, they won't be pursued because there'll be no sense that they exist and that could benefit the person. For instance, a lot of people with disabilities will have been raised under the expectation that work and employment is not going to be part of their future. And so it may, even if they might from time to time like to work, they may have been persuaded that they won't get work, that it's not part of their future. And so in that sense, people get resigned to a particular worldview through conditioning and reinforcement of a particular worldview. And that can lock people into limited life possibilities. And of course, that's at a greater risk with people with disabilities, but it's also more of a universal that we can all be self-limiting in our own way, simply because we are looking at the world as if certain things aren't really for us or wouldn't work for us or something of that sort. So we don't pursue them. So again, what that may mean is that people have many undeveloped, unrecognized potentials in life and capacities that are never explored because of the limited vision for them and also the conviction that they don't exist.
Yeah. As you're speaking, it reminded me of a quote. I don't know who to attribute this to, but it's, if you don't have a plan, you're part of somebody else's plan, and their plan might not be that good for you. So when I think about this in the context of an individual that has a developmental disability, it could be someone else has the plan of a segregated classroom for you. Someone has the plan for you that you will never work. Someone has the plan for you that you are going to live in a group home. And that plan just isn't that good. There's better, more optimal things out there for you in the world. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a very apt way of putting it, really, because in the absence of a vision, the vision of others fills the vacuum. And if that vision is a kind of negative one or limited one, it occupies the ground that defines what people do with their life. And, this is societal in nature, that certain societies will have a lack of collective vision, such as, for instance, in the Canadian context, the vision of Indigenous people is largely negative and devaluing. And something like 40% of female prisoners in Canada are Indigenous women, in the women's prison system. And that's no accident. That's a societal vision for Indigenous people.
And this isn't a topic that that I know the stats on, but I could see the same being the same for people of color, especially in the United States.
Yeah, well, many countries actually. But again, yes, you can see it then in the empiricism of big numbers, because you see that this is no accident that people are treated a particular way because of the shared view of them in the society in which they find themselves. And all societies tend to produce devalued groups at the margins. And that's, again, if you could look at it in that way, people may not be conscious of it or on a daily basis, but if you step back, you see that this is an entrenched belief system built on typically negative vision of the particular group.
And people with disabilities are viewed typically in society as devalued. So when thinking about vision for an individual that has a developmental disability, how can you start to break free of that? and maybe one of the things that comes to mind for me that I know you're quite fluent in is thinking about culturally valued analog. So maybe you could speak to that and whatever else comes to mind for you, Michael, on breaking free of that devaluation by society.
Well, I think what is devalued initially is the very presence of a disability. It's seen as a negative factor or feature of a person. And people then generalize from the disability to the person in their entirety. So you're no longer a full human being. You're a full human being that's sort of lacking. And then assumptions follow from that perception, that original perception. Now, if you wanted to change that, then you would have to say, well, yes, the person does have a disability. In fact, most people will live with some kinds of impairments, but it need not really affect the fullness of your life potentials. So that you could, for instance, be a bit hard of hearing and still have a quite rich life. You could be physically impaired in some ways and yet have a quite rich life. But that vision for the rich life is overshadowed by the negative vision of the apparent disability of the person. And so it's interesting with the person-centered movement in the disability field, as well as elsewhere. What people have been trying to emphasize for years has been it's the person that matters, not the disability. And who is this person and what are their life potentials? Because that person-centered assumption starts the thinking process of what is the fullness of this person's humanity and how might that be materialized or brought into greater evidence. So in that sense, the person's seen as full of potentials, notwithstanding that they live with some kind of an impairment.
Mm. And I'm just thinking through that, and it makes a lot of sense to focus on the person and the uniqueness of the person, what that person's good at, great at, their interests, where they would like to explore. But what are your thoughts on the disability side of things? Like, I'm just trying to think through it in terms of their disability still exists. It's a part of who they are. There's an acknowledgement of that within for that individual and for the people around them. So when thinking about their vision, how do you still acknowledge that disability or impairment that they have?
Just by being honest and accurate about it, but not giving it more emphasis than its needs. For instance, it'd be very obvious if somebody was mobility impaired that there'd be situations where they'd have considerable difficulty because they're mobility impaired. For instance, in winter conditions on sidewalks and so on, wouldn't be very good for somebody using a electric powered wheelchair. But it would also be true for a lot of people that ice and snow impairs them. And so it's living within one's limits is what you do with any kind of impairment. For instance, on icy days in winter, it's very interesting how many people slip and fall on the ice because their balance isn't very good. But you can have a perfectly good life and just be careful when you're around ice. So it's living with the impairment in a kind of shrewd or practical way that it kind of doesn't neutralize it. It says it's only worth some of the attention. And you raised the question of the culturally valued analog. It's, of course, a term that comes out of social role valorization theory. But what the culturally valued analog is helpful for is it helps people think about what would a person of the same age be typically doing with their life. And so the culturally valued analog is really what do most people do at a certain age in their life. For instance, if you're 6 years old, would you be in school? If you're a 25-year-old, would you be either doing further study or would you be working at a regular job? So it often gets the value of it is helps people think about people in normative terms as being part of the mix of normal life opportunities. What that does then is build vision for those life opportunities as something that this person could conceivably access. For instance, a good example of this is young people, when they start out in life, often like to travel, to see the world a bit, Mm-hmm. And there was a time I didn't see very many people with developmental disabilities traveling to see the world. These days, it's quite common. But as long as the practicalities are taken care of, many people with disabilities can travel pretty much like anybody else. And so the issue of the opportunity for life experiences associated, for instance, with international travel, or should be as available to them as anybody else if the practicalities can be worked out.
Yeah, that's helpful. So I think there's some important points there that you've shared, Michael. So acknowledging or being accurate and honest about the disability, but not giving it more attention that it needs, right? So still having the focus on the person, and not letting that limit the scope or the richness of the vision because of the disability. And I really like how you explained, with a culturally valued analog, what would another person of similar, gender, vintage, nationality do? Like what's normal for someone else that's of similar traits, characteristics, that doesn't have a disability or is viewed as normal by society, and using that as a frame to help think through what a potential vision is for that person. So I guess for somebody who's listening, Michael, who might be a mother or a father or a sibling who has a loved one with a developmental disability, or it could be even a supporter or a person with a developmental disability themselves, how would you suggest starting this process? So they're listening and they're thinking, okay, this creating a vision sounds like it would be helpful for my life. It would help me to have some direction, something to aim at, to move forward toward. How all this sounds great. How do I go about doing it?
That's a good question, because when you're unfamiliar with something, it's a lot more difficult. So in that sense, with time and practice, people can face this challenge much easier manner than would be if it's your first time of thinking about it. For instance, one of the consequences of living with the disabilities is that you're very likely to end up living in or existing in segregated and congregated environments, largely in the company of other people with disabilities. And that can start at segregated preschool programs, and then segregated schooling, and so on. And so for a family, an interesting question is, using the culturally valued analog, what would be the inclusive or socially integrated option as opposed to the segregated option? For instance, many young people might opt to go to guides or to Cubs or Scouts. These days, many parents wouldn't think about doing that. because they think, well, there should be sort of scouts for the disabled or something like that. When in fact, the Boy Scouts of America Association, for now over a generation, has welcomed people with disabilities as regular members in their various groups, And so there's the question of vision. We've schooled many families to think that the option they should start with is the segregated option, when in fact, the better option might be to ask the question, well, what do most people do? And why is it that the person with a disability isn't where everybody else is? And there might be good reasons why they're not there, but are they impediments that could be resolved? For instance, there may be consequences of living with a disability that intrude upon their ability to join a particular group, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't join. It just means that we need to support that situation so that the person can be successful in it. And we may not know at the outset what that looks like. But as long as you have the intent of it, you can begin to do that practical work of figuring out, well, how could we make that person successful? For instance, there are many people with disabilities that I know that quite enjoy swimming. And there's lots of open swimming opportunities in public pools and things where anybody can come and swim. And so if it's that the person might have behavior that puts people off, well, you got to figure out, well, what could help with that? Or the person doesn't know what good conduct is in a swimming pool, well, you could figure out what to do with that. Or the person, isn't very good in judging their swimming ability, well, what sort of support might they need? So as you just raise these what ifs, you can begin the process of figuring out, well, what would offset that? What would support the person to be successful in that situation? And of course, you can now see countless public swimming pools where people with disabilities are present, almost unnoticed, really, most of the time. I remember it was very interesting for me one time. I was swimming lanes, and I was just pulling up to the end of the pool to get water out of my goggles, and there was a young man with Down syndrome who was doing exactly the same thing I was doing, which was taking a break for a minute to get their goggles cleared. And I thought, well, on some level, this is the most profoundly ordinary thing in the world. But the fact that there hadn't been a lot of people with Down syndrome swimming lanes, in my experience, meant that this was a first for me. I'd never encountered a co-swimmer who had Down syndrome at that point. That would have been, a generation back. But it's nowadays I don't think anybody remark on it. But at that time, it was new to me. I hadn't seen that kind of inclusion of people with disabilities in a generic activity in quite the same way. So as you can see, my quite different now from what it would have been at that point, because I would have had limited examples. Well, probably may have been longer even than a generation back. But in any event, you can see that vision can shift, and when it shifts, it can create new life opportunities. So it's not inconsequential vision. It's going back to your first question, is it fluffy? It's not fluffy at all, because vision creates realities and, if you like, prevents realities.
Right. And I like your question, what would the inclusive option be? I think for many of us, I think I mentioned this earlier, is that we just get stuck in the default. We get stuck in the limited menu options that are presented to us. So, that could be the Special Olympics swimming, and viewing that as, well, that's the only option, because it's viewed as the safe option. It's viewed as the option that my son or daughter or brother or sister, loved one, will be accepted there. And then somehow the door closes, and that's the only option. That's what we're going to do. And I like your question, what would be the inclusive option? And thinking through, well, what other options are there? Okay, the inclusive option is the open swim, or the inclusive option is the aquafit class that everybody else attends, or just thinking through, or maybe it's joining a swim team. And thinking through that, right? And it's also bringing in, I like that question because it's also very closely tied to what's the culturally valued analog, right? What's the normative thing to do?
And there's such an array of things that are within the culturally valued analog. It's not like you have to do what everybody else does. You find your place in the culturally valued analog as to doing what suits you. For instance, even if one of the options in the culturally valued analog might be swimming, a lot of people don't care to swim, but they might love to do square dancing, or they might love to, play pool, or they might, do any number of other recreational things. So the culturally valued analog is so massive in terms of the life opportunities. You really, at the individual level, then find your niche in all of that, the parts of the inclusive world that most appeal to you, because we can't get up and do everything, and we don't want to. For instance, some people just love food and love cooking, and there's just hundreds of ways to express that love, and people find their niche with cooking and with food. For instance, you develop a certain taste for certain kinds of cuisines, but it's all part of the culturally valued analog. But you don't have to participate in everything. You participate in the elements of the culturally valued analog that resonate with your nature, and for which you find the encounter with those things satisfying. For instance, a very good example is just what kinds of things people turn to by way of entertainment that they enjoy, and what others don't enjoy, So it's, for instance, there are people who are just very into music or particular kinds of music, but that would mean that there'd be all kinds of people that wouldn't be into that kind of music. So in this sense, the culturally valued analog isn't imposed on people. It is there to be explored for people to find out a little bit who they are and what they'd like to do. And with people with disabilities, that exploration maybe stymied a bit because people settle on a limited range of options rather than showing a certain adventurousness in terms of other things that people might enjoy. But nobody would think they would enjoy it, or they just think, oh, well, that just wouldn't work, or whatever. And I've always enjoyed being surprised by what people enjoy, because who would have known, I'll give you an example. There's a guy I know quite well I know his mother and family quite well in New Zealand. And he's a deeply religious man. And if he could have done his life the way he really wanted it, he would have liked to have been a Catholic priest. And he has done everything up to that at this point. He's just very devout, and his faith is very important to him. And he's a man with Down syndrome. And he's found roles in the Catholic Church for himself that are quite satisfying, but he's still a little discontented. He would have liked to have been a priest, so Catholic priest. But you could see he's been on a journey, trying to find out who he was and what was important to him, and he's come a great distance. Even though he's, he still has ambitions beyond where he's got to.
Mm-hmm. I love how you put it, Michael, thinking about what resonates with your nature, or what resonates with that person's nature. what's unique about them, and what are they truly interested in. I just love how you put that phrase, and it's a great story around the man with Down syndrome that is really into religion and wants to be a Catholic priest, and it makes me think about a couple of different ways to think about where you want to go in life. So, and with vision. So we've kind of, I think, kind of maybe a bottom up approach is thinking about goals. So something very specific, such as I want to be a Catholic priest, versus kind of going from a higher level down, which would be more setting a vision. So, this is my view for what I view my life to be, and then kind of flushing out that vision and looking at, this is what I want my family life to be. This is what I want my life of contribution to look like, with whether that's work or volunteering. And looking at, I think, as you would put it, different domains of life, and creating a bigger, more holistic version, and then slowly dialing that down to the level of detail of goals. So I think there's maybe multiple ways to set a path forward. What suggestions might you have for listeners in terms of a starting point, thinking about, okay, I understand the default options. I understand that there's better. And as you could put it, I want to imagine better. When starting that process, would you suggest to, I guess, what's a good starting point?
Well, I think it's always good to do things with others because there's more resources than trying to do everything yourself. So in that sense, if you want to build a bigger vision, then it's better to do that in conjunction with other people that can help with the imagination process, or the imagining better process. And of course, not everybody's good at imagining better. So if you could pick wisely, you'd pick people that are more visionary in nature, or their vision is further evolved than others on that particular topic. So that's a very good starting point for having regular sessions where you just try to imagine better for yourself or for someone else. But if it's the regularity of doing that, because you build vision over time, it's not something you do once, you do it many times, and you revisit and refashion the vision many times. That's why it's you could see it almost as an ongoing process, as opposed to something you've only done once or twice.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so bringing other people in, getting their ideas, their contributions, ideally having these people being visionary, and doing that on some sort of regularity or cadence, because your vision's going to evolve over time as you try things, and maybe you learn that, oh, I don't really like that, or I do really like that, or that thing doesn't resonate with my nature, and then slowly figuring that out and setting your new direction. So I really love how you put that. Now, when thinking about bringing other people in, a couple things come to mind for me in terms of maybe being on the same page. So I could see, I think you kind of set a caution already around maybe bringing somebody in that's closed-minded, or bringing somebody in that maybe has a limited worldview for people with disabilities. So is it important to talk about maybe shared values or shared principles before starting this process with a group of people?
I think to the extent that you can do that, it's very consciousness raising, because it makes us aware of not only differences of values and principle, but also differences of priorities that people may have that influence their take on things. For instance, a lot of people don't like to do things that look difficult. And yet, if you're going to break new ground in life, you're going to have to do some difficult things. And you're going to have to open yourself up to certain kinds of challenges that otherwise you might not have done. So you're looking for traits in people that will help not only with the imagining better, but also the doing that flows from imagining better. If you like, the implementing of a vision or the putting it into place. And this is why if you want to build enthusiasm for something, you don't want to invite a bunch of wet blankets to join in the process. You'd rather have people that are much more affirming and positive rather than naysayers. So there is a sense of you have to have a sense of practicality of who are likely to be people that are a good fit for the challenge that's to be faced. And not everybody's suited for every challenge. But another thing I think that's very important, apart from the regularity of imagining better, is also the fact of seeking examples of better. Because vision isn't compelling to people if there's no proof of it. And when somebody's already achieved what you think you might like to achieve, it means that it's doable. For instance, I remember in the early days when we were trying to get people a home of their own, we rarely saw people that had achieved that. Now, today, you'll find all kinds of people with disabilities that do have a home of their own, modest homes and not so modest homes, but it is really their home. And so it's a credible option because of all these good examples. When you say, well, the person's much more disabled, they couldn't have a home of their own. Well, there'd be all kinds of people that are more disabled that have a home of their own. Because as long as you have the right supports, your disability may not matter a whole lot. But if you're unsupported in an option, you could get into difficulties if you did need particular kinds of support. So I think it's really good to building vision, to see what people have already accomplished. And even you can learn a lot about that even remotely, just by the stories that are told or the videos of what they've done, or sort of those kinds of indirect ways. Even though you've not met the person, you can know what they've done with their life. That's why it's good to keep looking for it on the presumption that there is better, because you'll find it eventually if you're looking. If you're not looking, it almost has to run you over, which isn't necessarily good odds. So it's probably better to do a bit of searching for the good or the better in multiple ways. And in that sense, a very good way to do that is through joining social networks of one kind or another that share a common interest. So many families have their vision built by joining in with other groups of very progressive-minded families, because they are helped in their own journey by the journeys of the other families. And as you might imagine. So I think it's harder to do this in isolation. So seeking out supportive social networks is often a very important catalyst for people to keep moving, not get stuck.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very important point. As humans, we rely a lot on our eyes and our our vision. Our literal vision. And I think we often say things such as I'll believe it when I see it, or I won't believe it until I see it. And the point that you're bringing up here is it can be hard to imagine that future for our loved one until we've seen it. And one way to hack that, or to get further belief that it's possible, is to see how someone similar has already done that, and how they're living it. And as you suggested, Michael, I think family groups, social networks are a great place to get those stories and to meet those people, to learn. I think there's also great value in learning from them. So, what were your first steps, and what were maybe the challenges that you have overcome, and who else should I talk to? Just great resources on helping to gain momentum and support through that journey. And I think there's also a lot of great places online. Like, there's a lot of stories that have been shared of, for example, people with developmental disabilities that have their own homes. So Partners for Planning, for example, p4p.ca has many great videos sharing these types of stories that can provide some inspiration.
No, there really is, and it's good to alert people to that fact, because we don't know what we don't know, and that's why reaching out allows others to update us, or to steer us in a different direction, or to link us to some resource we don't know about. So in this sense, being willing to be mentored by someone that's further along in the journey is a big help, because you're prepared to, get some pointers on what to think about and who to talk to, and in this sense, so you can sort of learn from seasoned people what the ins and outs are. And that's, of course, it's not just educational and vision building, it's also capacity building, because you end up being coached by somebody who knows what they're doing. And that, not necessarily on everything, but certainly on lots of things. And that strengthens your hand. Further, though, it's often people can serve as role models. And role models are something that are important to our development, because we emulate the role model, whoever that person might be, and follow in their footsteps. It's a very key way to learn is through imitation and modeling. But if there's an absence of role models, there'll be an absence of growth in those areas that the role model represents. So in this way, in life, we've probably all benefited from different kinds of role models. And we may not always have been conscious of it, but if you can at least be open to the idea, then it gives people a stronger hand in vision building and vision doing.
Yeah, so I agree with the importance, Michael, of collaborating with other people and bringing in their ideas to create a vision, because it's going to be more rich, more robust from those ideas and contributions of others. I think when I think about my sister's life, so my sister, Sarah, has a developmental disability, and going through the visioning process with her multiple times now, it's, I think, one of the most valuable things, aside from getting others' inputs and ideas, and those people also know my sister very well, so they're able to help provide insights on, what things are, what resonates with my sister's nature, which has been super valuable. But I think the other really valuable piece is in the doing, as you mentioned earlier, and to have people in your social network that have this, that are all headed in the same direction in terms of how they think about your vision and how they're thinking about your life, and having alignment with you, and going down that path, I think is a super powerful thing.
I quite agree. I mean, these networks don't have to be extensive, but they do need to be present, because if you like, vision is a shared reality. It's not just an individual reality. And shared vision means that people join together in the effort. They have enough in common in terms of their vision that they can play helpful roles in achieving that vision. So and part of that's coordinated by having a similar vision, not necessarily identical, but similar vision, and a similar level of resolve to do something about that vision. And of course, thirdly, that people bring different strengths then, or capacities, that can aid in the doing, depending on what their skill set is or their talents, that sort of thing. So it's a richer mix than if we all just tried to do this on our own.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And those social networks can look a little bit different for each person. And I had a good conversation with Rebecca Pauls from Plan in British Columbia on personal support networks. So listeners can go check out that conversation if they want to learn more about personal support networks and social networks. But they come in different varieties. One that people or listeners might be familiar with are support circles, but I don't think to create your vision, you have to have a support circle. We all have our own personal networks. I have one. Michael, you have one. It might be a little bit less formal than a support circle, but I think it's just important to point out that there's maybe different types of social networks, and they can look different, and they don't have to look a specific way to help you to create and live out your vision. However, a different structure, the right structure for you, I think, is something that you need to determine in terms of how you want your social network or your personal support network to look and to work with you.
And it's certainly more discouraging when people are socially isolated.
Mm-hmm.
They just easily run out of steam. Whereas being connected with people keeps adding sort of energy and resolve. And that wouldn't be there if people were more isolated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So, Michael, we before the conversation that we had today, we spoke a little bit about a life-giving vision versus a life-denying vision. And one simple example that comes to mind for this would be the vision of having an individual having a home of their own, which would, in the example that I'm thinking, would be life-giving, versus life-denying would be the example where someone with a developmental disability lives in a group home. And I'm making that classification based on having a home of your own. You're well supported, and you have choice and control in your home, versus living in a group home where your choice and control is limited. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about life-giving visions versus life-denying visions, and I'm wondering if you might have any examples of those.
Yeah, I think a very interesting, inspiring example of this would be some services I've seen for people with complex medical needs who are living in a home of their own, but getting all the healthcare supports they need. So in other words, they have the best of both worlds. They have very good support, medical support, as well as other kinds of support, but they also have a home of their own, where really they're the captain of the ship, and it's not a institutional setting. It's just a natural home of one's own. And yet, I think a lot of people would think, oh, since they have such complex medical needs, they should be in a nursing home or some such place. And so if the assumption is that, oh, that's where they should be, then you're going to knock out the possibility of being in your own home and having a home of one's own. So the vision for the person needs a nursing home is life denying, because it knocks out life-giving things like having a home of your own. And it's unnecessary because you can, what this example demonstrates, this particular service, is that you can build in good medical supports such that people can have a life of their own and a home of one's own. So they're not mutually kind of canceling each other out. They're in fact integrated as part of a unified solution to other needs that the person has besides their medical needs. Otherwise, I mean, if you don't grant that people want a life of their own, then the attention might just go to what are the services they need rather than what is the life they need. So a life-giving vision isn't just life about that you're getting the right supports, it's that you're getting a life. So that's what life-giving is. It gives you life opportunities that might not exist otherwise. And life-denying vision, such as thinking somebody should be in a nursing home, means that you give up everything so that you can get your medical care, which is a false choice, given that example. So you can see the interplay between life-giving choices and life-denying choices just in that example. But again, another example of this would be employment. There would be states in the United States, for instance, where about 75 to 80% of people are working at regular jobs in the community. And yet there'd be other jurisdictions in the U.S. where it'd be a fraction of that. Or in other countries. For instance, the Canadian numbers aren't quite as sizable as the American. So the vision is weaker for employment as a life possibility. And so the if you like, the American leading edge of that is a challenge to our vision, because it shows what can really be done. And with even, when 3 out of 4 people are working, that's a very significant amount of employment. And because it wasn't like that 30, 40 years ago, it would be probably a third of that. So not only are people working, they're massively working more than a generation and a half ago. So you can see that vision has the potential to transform people's, employment potential. First of all, to see that they have potential, and then to be able to do something about that potential in a regular, inclusive employment set. If that vision isn't present, it just won't happen. And one of the things that I enjoy telling people about is that it has happened. And it just gives greater credibility to the claim that people could have an expanded life in terms of normal employment. So there are many such examples of life-giving vision, and it doesn't mean that people need to believe the vision initially. They may test that vision, want proof of it or be further persuaded, which is understandable, because conviction about the vision doesn't necessarily arrive at the same time as being exposed to a vision. So people will, if you like, kick the tires, test it, and whatnot. But if they are persuaded eventually, then they'll begin to act on that vision. And that's what we see. We see a lot more people that went through the struggle of, is it possible? And eventually became persuaded. And now we have people people with disabilities that believe they can work, their parents believe they can work and get paid, the community around them sees them working. So the whole vision of everybody more collectively shifts over the decades as people become, if the proof of it becomes more and more evident.
Michael, we've covered a lot here in terms of vision, and I think at a minimum, we've helped to raise the consciousness of those that have listened around the importance of vision and setting a direction, and having people with disabilities being the captain of their ship, but also bringing other people on board their ship to set sail towards the direction that they want to travel toward. And I think you've done a good job of helping to raise the consciousness and give some ideas on how people can start. Are there any final messages that you want to leave listeners today?
Yeah, I think vision won't prosper unless there are leaders who sort of mobilize people around the vision. Because vision, you have to have buy-in to vision, and you have to win that buy-in. And this is where leadership is very helpful, not just individual leadership, but also collective leadership. And because leadership is constantly something we need for the next wave of whatever we're going to do, investments in visionary leadership are really a good investment, because you then have the leadership you need because you've invested in cultivating that leadership. And in some cases, it's not just that you need new leadership, which you will, but you also need leadership renewal, because it's a long struggle for people chasing a vision, trying to make it happen. And so that people need ways to get re-energized, renewed, recommitted. And a lot of that takes place in the context of networks and social movements. And you think of any group of activists, they help support each other, but they also are challenged by each other. And in the process, there's more leadership catalyzed, stimulated. And so I think vision, without the constant sort of stimulation and renewal of the vision, it can go a bit flat, and people lose their vision. And when they lose vision, they stop. Basically, they kind of get to a point and they don't go further. So if you want further progress, you need to often redevelop the vision for the next wave, whatever that next wave might be. For instance, just going back to the employment example, you might be very successful in certain types of businesses, and less so in others, because you don't really know how to influence that sector of the economy. And so you need a different kind of leadership possibly for the next wave of challenges to employment. For instance, a good example of this is just the major progress we've seen with individual small businesses for people with disabilities, or what sometimes are called micro enterprises, are sort of one-person businesses. And that's a very important niche, because all kinds of businesses have been created in and around a particular person with a disability that have been quite viable businesses. And this goes back for some time now. So we're seeing that aspect of employment is now getting and has received quite a bit of leadership, and therefore we're seeing a lot of progress in it. Whereas in other areas, we might see very little penetration of people with disabilities into particular workforces. So that might require a different kind of leadership going forward. So I always like to link vision with needs, on the one hand, what people need, but also vision with leadership, because it takes leadership to get implementation of vision. and to update that vision when it needs updating. So I see that as a kind of investment challenge. By investing in people and emerging leadership, we're seeding the ground for the next wave of what needs to get done. So all of these are interrelated as a practical matter.
I love that. And Michael, thank you for your vision to help us create better, more inclusive, rich lives for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and people that are marginalized. So just some sincere gratitude for you and for coming on the podcast today and doing the work that you do. So thank you. All right. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Michael Kendrick as much as I did. And hopefully it gave you an opportunity to think about vision and maybe open your mind to vision, its importance, why we need vision, why we need to have a vision, why it's important for an individual with a developmental or intellectual disability to have a vision, and how to go about creating that vision and then doing the work, as Michael put it, to implement that vision and the leadership that it takes around that. So I hope this podcast started to open your mind, but also give you the building blocks to creating a good life and imagining a better life and to doing the work to help individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities to have a good life. So I ask you to maybe think about one final thing. What is the next step that you're going to take to help your loved one or to support your loved one in creating a big, bold vision for their life? What is that one next step? And that is my challenge to you leaving this podcast. Now, as we wrap up this podcast episode, I want to ask you one quick favor. I want to ask you to sign up and subscribe to the Empowering Ability podcast on your smartphone. So whether you have an Apple or an Android phone, you can do this. So if you have an Apple phone, it's just the podcast icon, the purple icon on your phone. Click on that and then type in Empowering Ability in the search. Empowering Ability in the search. And if you're on Android, any podcast app that you use, it could be Spotify or it could be Podbean or it could be Stitcher, whatever podcast app you're using, just go to your podcast app and type in Empowering Ability and hit subscribe, and new episodes will go directly to your phone. So this helps in terms of me getting you new episodes, and it helps to grow Empowering Abilities. So if you could stop what you're doing and go to your podcast app, type in Empowering Ability and hit subscribe, that would be incredible. I also want to remind you that you can subscribe. This is a different kind of subscribe. Subscribe to Empowering Ability by going to the website, empoweringability.org, and contributing your hard-earned dollars towards the development of new content, new episodes, new blogs, and the new paid content that is coming. You will get access to that by subscribing now. And you can select the level of subscription that you would like to move forward with. So that's totally up to you what you would like to pay, but it's a huge benefit towards the development of this work, the continuation of this work, and it's also an investment in yourself. And thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. If you like this episode and you think you know someone that would benefit, please share it with them. Be a part of the change to think differently about disability.